Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 116th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'll revisit the concept of retrocausality, or the fact that something that happens today affects what happened in the past. Put in other words, the past, present, future entanglement. The fact that ultimately all events are linked to one another, and that time is more like a sort of a chain where everything is linked to everything else, rather than something that is where the present, the past, and the future are kind of disconnected. So I hope this one will be a short one because I have like a little practical example to show you. So you probably, in my earlier videos, I was talking about the fact that ultimately time expands like a bubble. Um, and that ultimately everything is tied to everything else. And for instance, that if you and your friends start a campfire in the future, you are sending information or intuition into the past for your ancestors, um, like prehistoric men, to master fire when they see like lightning strike a tree and that piece of wood catches on fire. Then because you're doing that in the future, it affects it's like you're the same species, so it's like you're communicating into the past to yourselves, to have that intuition to pick up the burning branch and master fire, which in turn enables you in your future to do the campfire. And so every single event is linked to every other event and is entangled in such a way that time is really like this unbreakable sort of, it's like a chain of events. And this might paint a sort of a universe which is predetermined. And it is from the point of view of one timeline, which happens simultaneously from past to future, from going from zero to infinity. But time also expands outward. And that's where the unpredictability happens, is that from a previous sort of present moment where you were here, this was also sort of a chain, but reality wasn't as rich. And there you didn't have, for instance, the Big Bang and all those theories that we have from our perspective, modern perspective. This was a time where the universe was only 6,000 years old with the Bible and all that stuff. So the universe expands, and it's just that it does a like the timeline is basically fixed and has a certain length depending on the elements that you bring into the narrative of the universe at that point in time. But everything expands all the time in all directions. And so one way to call this is via the oops, morphogenetic field. See, Rupert Sheldrake has this concept of morphogenetic fields, which are fields where a species can share information. Um, and so it's this, 100th monkey concept, where once 100 monkeys have mastered an idea, then monkeys that live, 100 miles from there can start spontaneously developing the same kind of behavior, even though they never were in touch with the tribe of 100 monkeys that mastered certain behavior. It's the same principle, except that this works across time. And now I wanted to um, give you a practical example of what I see, because this is all theoretical, but a practical example of where I see retrocausality. You see, today, which is the animal that the humans use most for their science experiments? Mice or rats? So, oops, I'm really bad with drawing. Mice or rats. And we do all kinds of things with them. We test vaccines, we test medication, we do genetic engineering modifications. I mean, you've seen pictures where you have a rat where you grow a piece of human limb inside of the rat. Like, for instance, this very famous picture of the rat with an ear growing inside of it. Um, Maybe I'll actually find it for you. Yeah, so here you go. I mean, oops, you have mice that are experimented on to grow human limbs inside of them. I mean, you have just a ton of practical applications for with people experimenting with mice. That is the prime animal that we're experimenting on, and we're injecting them plenty of different genes and doing plenty of different manipulations on them. But what's interesting is that the latest research also suggests that our ancestors, the earliest known ancestor of the human species, and of all mammals, as a matter of fact, most mammals, is a rodent. Um, some, what is it, 160 million years ago, I think. Well, you're here, 145 million years ago. And so, isn't that interesting? And to me, that is an example of this kind of retrocausality, is that we, from our future, what we perceive as our future, are experimenting on, mice, doing all kinds of experiments. We inject genes into them, we manipulate them, we give them our DNA, basically. We inject our DNA into them. And that mice are basically a rodent. And in the past, these mice that were roaming about in the prehistoric age are our ancestors, our common ancestor with all the other mammals. And you have these kind of different retrocausality loops for just about anything. And they're not always as clear and simple to see as this example with the rodent, where the genetic manipulations and the experiments that we do on the rodent in the future actually affects the way these rodents will evolve in the past. And they will evolve, of course, much quicker than other rodents or other mammals or other species, because we're adding information to the morphogenic field from our future. And the fact that they evolved into us enables us to experiment on them and sort of artificially quicken their evolutionary phase from the future. And now you look at, for instance, all the stories about the Anunnaki and, like these beings that created humans. And, I mean, if you listen to some channelers, we are the result of the mix between 7 different ET races and all that stuff. It's the same exact mechanic, if you will, is that from their future, let's say, for instance, that from their future, they're working on genetics on themselves. For instance, they're actually doing some genetic manipulation on themselves, and that retrocausally affects us into the past when we were just prehistoric men, for instance. from the future. But again, don't forget that all this expands outward. And so we're always adding complexity by expanding the timeline. And that's what, for instance, ascension to 5D is basically, is that you go from linear time to nonlinear time to simultaneous time to multidimensionality, and that expands your bubble, your circle, your timeline from a fixed timeline, which is linear, where you have past, this is like the past, you have like a present and future, to something three-dimensional when you can actually see this from the perspective that I'm looking at, for instance, from my tablet in three dimensions, where this expands. It's almost like it becomes a sphere, and you can sort of start to play around with it and saying, well, maybe if I pick this past, then it'll take me to that future. And I mean, it's really a completely different perspective that expands what is possible in the universe exponentially. What is possible is in terms of the experience, and in terms of growing this bubble further. So this was a short episode. I hope you found this interesting, and you have a much more practical kind of understanding of how retrocausality works, and also how that principle may apply to some stories that you hear about where humans come from. Um, we are as much responsible for what happens to us now, just like, via this experimenting on the mice, even though we're doing it unconsciously, as some beings may be responsible for our evolution here on Earth, and vice versa. We're also affecting them into the future via our present, and it is very much a symbiotic kind of relationship. And when everything helps everything else, or everything assists everything else, that's how all of this sort of expands outwards, simultaneously, of course. So I hope you found this interesting, and talk to you in the next episode.